a former beauty queen running the police investigation into Poppi Worthington's death, admitted she did not know how to deal with the death of a child. Detective Inspector Amanda Sadler, who was the 1989 Miss Great Britain, had no experience of leading an inquiry into child death and was not qualified to be a senior investigating officer. The 51-year-old had also not completed a child death course and had never read Basic Investigation Protocol, an inquest heard. Basic steps, laid out in black and white in a document known as Chapter 13, were not carried out, Coroner David Roberts said. It came as Poppi's father, Paul Worthington, refused to say why the toddler's DNA was on his genitals before she died amid accusations of a bungled police investigation. Forensic evidence was not sent for testing for months, the bedsheets where Poppi collapsed were not collected, and her body was not swabbed for evidence for 5 days. The extraordinary admissions were made as the shamed policewoman gave evidence to the inquest into Poppi Worthington's death on Thursday. A family court judge ruled that Paul Worthington sexually assaulted the 13-month-old in their Barrow-in-Furness home hours before she died. But police bungles meant that the case has never reached court, and Worthington, who gave evidence to the inquest, remains a free man. Mrs. Sadler admitted gross incompetence and was demoted to sergeant but retired in September 2016. Yesterday she said, "I wasn't at that time NCO or trained to that level. I hadn't undergone any child death training." She admitted, under questioning from the Mr. Roberts, that she had never read a document called Chapter 13, which lays out the protocol for investigating of child death. Mr. Roberts said, "Did you read it after you were given the case?" Mrs. Sadler replied, "I didn't read it on the day, I've read it since." Her supervisor, Detective Superintendent Mike Forrest, admitted he had never heard of some of the steps laid out in the document the inquest heard. He was found to have a case to answer for gross misconduct. He retired aged 48 on a full pension before disciplinary actions could be taken. She was smuggled out of the back door of the court under police guard to evade police photographers. Mr. Worthington was accused of sexually abusing 13-month-old Poppi shortly before her tragic death in 2012, but he escaped prosecution amid claims of a bungled police investigation. In particular, a laptop Mr. Worthington used to watch adult X-rated porn in bed on the night Poppi died was never recovered by Cumbria police, and there was no proactive attempts by officers to trace it. Mr. Justice Peter Jackson said last year the toddler suffered a penetrative sexual assault before her sudden death, and the only person who could realistically have done this to her was her father. Giving evidence for a second day today, Poppi's father refused to answer 183 questions by citing Rule 22, which allows witnesses at inquests to avoid incriminating themselves. Yesterday he refused 69. But he did reply to a question about Poppi's personality and said she was a lovely, bubbly, happy child, adding she could bully in her own little way. He was asked specifically why her DNA was on his genitals and why she was bleeding from her bottom. He refused to say, but the inquest heard he had told police it was because he had been to the toilet after trying to help her breathe. He was also asked if he had sexually abused her or smothered her with a pillow and again refused to answer before he broke down in tears. Medical staff at Furness General Hospital told the toddler's inquest this week she had arrived in A. Former Detective Constable Lindsay Bolton was told by Mr. Worthington that he no longer had the laptop he used to access pornographic material. Mr. Worthington told her he had sold the laptop to a man in Milham and he would try to get it back to hand to police for examination. Miss Hewitt asked her, "Did that happen? Did Mr. Worthington make efforts to retrieve the laptop?" Ms. Bolton replied, "Not to my knowledge." She said she informed her boss, former beauty queen Detective Inspector Amanda Sadler, about the situation before she went on leave. Later she found out Mr. Worthington had not brought the laptop into police, but no one followed the matter up. Throughout the hearing, Mr. Worthington refused to answer questions put to him by lawyers. Kate Stone, representing the mother, asked him about Poppi's health and taking him through events on the day she died. All her questions were unanswered by the witness. Ms. Stone continued, "Do you accept something caused Poppi to bleed before she went into the ambulance? Was she bleeding, Mr. Worthington, because you had put something into her? Why did you hurt your daughter, Mr. Worthington?" The witness shook his head and gave the stock reply he had used before. He went on to use the same answer to questions put to him about the whereabouts of the laptop on which he said he had been watching pornography on the night of his daughter's death. Over 2 sessions, 2 hours on Wednesday afternoon and 2 hours on Thursday, Mr. Worthington replied 252 times with the same answer. He replied with the same stock answer when questioned about several inconsistencies between his statements and accounts given to police and family courts and what he told paramedics and hospital doctors at different times. He was also asked about Poppi's DNA being found on his genitals, which he has previously said was by transfer from him holding the child then going to the lavatory at the hospital. Ms. Hewitt asked him whether he was aware of the view expressed by at least one pathologist that the findings of the post-mortem suggest that there had been penetration of Poppi. She continued, "Can I ask you expressly please? Did you penetrate Poppi at any time?" She continued, "Did you at any time place Poppi in a position where her face was pushed into a pillow? Or put your hand or an object over her face?" Mr. Worthington replied again in a quiet voice, "I refer to my earlier statements, Rule 22. Poppi's mother, who stormed out of the room yesterday, stayed in the inquest and looked visibly upset as he refused to answer question after question to avoid self-incrimination. He said, 'Really, just one final thing. I'm not going to repeat Rule 22. That said, my role is to try to establish how Poppi came by her death, and that needs to look at the facts and establish all available facts we can. Now you are perfectly entitled to rely on your legal right not to answer anything that might incriminate you. There's no inference drawn from that. That said, today is an opportunity for you to tell me anything you think may help me understand how Poppi came by her death. So I don't want you to leave court thinking you have not had the opportunity to tell me what happened as best you can remember about the facts of those hours. It's an opportunity. Is there anything else you would like to tell me?" Today he was again bundled into his daughter's inquest at Kendal, Cumbria, by police and used a hood to hide his face amid claims he has had death threats. He has repeatedly used Rule 22 of Britain's coroner's rules to avoid describing his relationship with Poppi or her mother in case his own evidence was incriminating, the inquest heard. When asked about sleeping arrangements at the family home and his daughter's morning routine, he also said repeatedly, "I rely on the right not to answer that under Rule 22. Poppi's mother, who cannot be named, then walked out as he refused to answer what happened in the 24 hours before Poppi died, after dodging 69 questions. Hours earlier her QC said she had waited 5 years for his evidence. It has emerged that Mr. Worthington has been in £50,000 a year witness protection since January 2016, when a judge said he probably abused Poppi, who suffered acute internal injuries before she died. Mr. Worthington, who denies hurting his daughter, did say that Poppi had a good appetite and was generally fit as a fiddle before her death. And he admitted he had an on-off relationship including sporadic sex with Poppi's mother, who did not like his OCD and the fact he watched too much sport on TV and liked to gamble. Earlier Mr. Worthington successfully demanded to be hidden from the public behind a screen after claiming he received death threats warning him he faced being killed or castrated. Cumbria Constabulary sent a marked patrol car to the front door of Kendal Coroner's Court as a decoy as the unmarked people carrier containing Worthington went to another entrance, witnesses said. At least 10 police officers were on duty outside the court despite no protesters being in attendance, but the force said it was necessary to ensure his safe arrival. The lawyer representing Poppi Worthington's mother, who cannot be named, told the coroner, "We support there should be no screen. She's waited almost 5 years for this hearing. Paul Clark, representing Mr. Worthington, said he has been in a long-term position of great vulnerability and risk, and he's been in a long-term position of witness protection, whereby currently his appearance and location is not known. There are photos of Mr. Worthington online, but what is not known to the public is currently his location, but also his current appearance. In this case, it has been apparent throughout that there's a real risk to Mr. Worthington's life, and even if not at a risk of death, risk of serious mistreatment and clearly substantial concerns outside these tangible risks and substantial concerns on Mr. Worthington's right to private life that has already been jeopardized, very substantially indeed. Following legal submissions over several hours, Mr. Roberts ruled in favor of the press. He directed that Mr. Worthington must give evidence in court in view of the press, but screened from anyone watching in the public gallery. Police failed to investigate until 8 months later. Despite medical experts, Poppi had injuries consistent with a sex attack, and her father has not been prosecuted. Today, Mr. Worthington started to give his version of events, and he claims he found her lifeless in his bed and had nothing to do with it. But he then used his right not to answer. Defending the number of officers involved in protecting him, a Cumbria Constabulary spokesman said Cumbria Constabulary this morning assisted in the arrival of Paul Worthington to Kendall County Hall, where he is due to give evidence at an inquest. Security arrangements have been in place for Mr. Worthington following threats made towards him. To ensure Mr. Worthington's safe arrival, a number of police resources were in place. Yesterday, consultant pediatrician Dr. Osama Brima described how he fought to resuscitate Poppi for 57 minutes at Furness General Hospital before she was pronounced dead. He noticed she was pouring fresh blood after she died, she told the inquest. He said, "I thought there was something wrong inside the child, and I was not comfortable. I was suspicious." He alerted Children's Services and examined her body again 5 hours later at 11 a.m. in the children's ward. He said Poppi was still bleeding fresh blood, which he found to be unusual. The doctor said Poppi's death was unexplained, and it has played on his mind. "It has stuck with me as quite significant," he said. "I have never seen an incident of this kind to any child in my career." Poppi arrived by ambulance to hospital shortly after 6 a.m. on 12 December 2012. Her first aid-trained father, Paul, a former ASDA night shift worker, was in the back with her, helping a paramedic perform CPR on the toddler. Nurse Sarah McQuiston scooped Poppi into her arms before rushing her into A. Blood was dribbling down her legs. She had no nappy on, Miss McQuiston told Kendall Coroner's Court. She said Poppi's stomach was distended, bloated. You could see it was quite tight, hard, a bit like a pregnant tummy, she said. Clinical support worker Kelly Viceroy-Grieve liaised with Paul and Poppi's in the hospital relatives' room. Paul has arrived in the ambulance dressed in just a blue t-shirt and jeans. He had no coat and had no shoes or socks on, though he had brought them with him. Miss Viceroy-Grieve said that Paul had told her that he had been still in his boxer shorts when the paramedic had arrived at their family home in Barrow in Furness, Cumbria. Mother, who cannot be identified for legal reasons, arrived separately to Paul. She was distraught, anxious, crying. She was talking more to Poppi's dad, asking him questions. "What's happened? Is she still alive?" said Miss Viceroy-Grieve. She said Paul told her what had happened with Poppi. He stated that he said she had woken up in her cot crying, so he put her into bed with him. He tried to give Poppi her dummy, but she wouldn't have it. Poppi was making a face like she needed a poo, so he put his fingers on each side of her nappy to try to get the nappy from her bottom so that she could try and push out with ease. He put 2 fingers on the side of her nappy so she could have a poo easily. He explained that he went downstairs to get a nappy. Paul said he went back upstairs to see Poppi, and she was asleep, and so he got back into bed with Poppi, Miss Viceroy-Grieve told Kendall Coroner's Court. He also added, "I don't know why, but I looked over to Poppi and touched her arm, and it was lifeless." Earlier, the inquest, which began on Monday, heard a harrowing 999 call from the girl's mother. who cannot be named for legal reasons, as her daughter lay dying. This fresh inquest was ordered by the High Court after the controversial first hearing in 2014, held by a different coroner, was shrouded in secrecy with Poppi listed as a child aged 13 months. Shortly before 6 a.m. on the day of her death, Mr. Worthington, who had put Poppi in his bed with him, went downstairs with her lifeless body and emergency services were called. Little over an hour later, at 7:07 a.m., Poppi was pronounced dead at Furness General Hospital, just a day after she had taken her first 2 steps. Poppi's mother was frequently visibly distressed as she gave evidence earlier this week, describing her relationship with the toddler's father as up and down. She described her daughter as very alive, bubbly. You knew she was there was no missing her, she said.